In the last lecture, we began looking at what's called the problem of evil, namely, how can a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and all good ordain and allow rampant evil in the world? Atheists say generally that renders that no God would do that, and that renders God's existence improbable. We introduce this by pointing out that that whole question really is baseless, in that God himself is the only adequate ground for saying that anything is objectively evil or good, right or wrong, moral or immoral, because otherwise it comes down to what this culture says or what you believe, but then another culture says it's perfectly okay, or you believe that, it's just a matter of personal preference. So one could never say that anything, whether child abuse or genocide, rape, murder, no one could say that that is wrong and immoral. So even raising the question, the atheist has to assume a Christian foundation, has to rely upon the Christian worldview. And I quoted from a couple of well-known atheists, Jean-Paul Sartre and ethicist Richard Taylor, who admitted that by throwing God out the window, you're throwing out any basis for right and wrong or any moral obligation. We also looked at the fact that these issues, or the question, basically is invalid, in that we talked about that even atheists admit that the so-called logical problem of evil does not hold water, that God's existence is compatible with the existence of evil, but they've turned, by emphasizing the amount of evil and the apparent gratuitous or pointlessness of evil, the severity of evil, and so on, saying that, well, that renders God, his existence, improbable. That's known as the inductive or evidential argument from evil. But we've said to make any kind of inductive argument or judgment as to the probability of something, you can only make a probability judgment based upon all the relevant available facts. The only fact that atheists use is the fact that evil exists. But they don't take into account the other things that show that God's existence not only is probable, but is absolutely true. Things like the implausibility of existence coming out of nothing, of life coming out of non-living matter, of thoughtful, sentient beings coming out of non-sentient matter. Things like the resurrection of Jesus Christ, fulfilled prophecy, evidence of miracles, and all these other things, because, as John Feinberg points out, that when you consider all this, some of this background data, which is necessary to make any inductive argument or probability judgment, may render God's existence so overwhelmingly probable that the existence of evil can't even touch it, and I think that is true. The atheist argument also is invalid because it basically comes down to, well, I would end evil, and I can't see that there's any good to this, and yet the difference between God has infinite knowledge. We don't know but a speck compared to him, and you look at, we can observe evil, but we can't observe the interrelationships or the evaluation, the why, God's relationship to this. And so, the difference between us and God in terms of what we can know, what we can see, is infinitely worse than a 1-month-old infant trying to understand his parents, because it's an infinite distance, and therefore there is no basis for saying, well, he probably doesn't exist because I can't see a good reason for it. I want to look at a few other things along those lines. One of the areas of evil that atheists bring up is so-called natural evils, earthquakes, floods, diseases, things like that. But ultimately, according to the Bible, the natural order went awry because of humanity's fall into sin. And so John Frame says, natural evil is a curse brought upon the world because of moral evil, Adam and Eve's disobedience, rebellion, and sin. Natural evil functions as a punishment to the wicked and as a means of discipline for those who are righteous by God's grace. And it reminds us of the cosmic dimensions of sin and redemption. And this also tells us that nothing now is as it was. When God created the world and created people, he said, everything is very good. Now the entire creation is fallen. It is not in the very good state, but it is corrupted and disordered, and that's why there is evil. And that came about from humanity. We're going to talk more later about the relationship of God and sin and evil. But Richard Swinburne also points out that there must be naturally occurring evils if people are to know how to prevent evil from occurring. And there need to be many such examples of this if we are to have knowledge. So, for example, if you're planning a city, you need to know, is this a place where earthquakes are likely to occur? You'll only know that if earthquakes have occurred in the past. There are a number of examples he gives that are in the book, but we need to know this in order to induce, because we have been put in charge by God of creation, and so we need to know what it is like. The other thing, of course, is the very thing that is beneficial about natural phenomena can also be detrimental. In other words, water is necessary for life, but you can drown in it. Gravity is necessary, but it can result in injury or death if somebody falls or if an airplane crashes. And to try and change that, think what would happen. Bruce Reichenbach says, what would it entail to alter the natural laws regarding digestion so that arsenic or other poisons would not negatively affect us? Wouldn't the arsenic or the human composition both have to be altered? Well, that would result in a different natural order. That would result in people other than human beings. What about fire? Well, if fire is altered so that it no longer burns, or if wood is altered so that it doesn't burn down, so your house doesn't burn down, you see, natural evil, to eliminate all of that would result in no longer having a world like we have it. And as we'll see later on, one of God's plans in creating the world was to create a world inhabited by human beings, not superhuman beings and not subhuman beings, but regular, non-glorified human beings. And that entails certain things that will naturally occur. May occur for good, may occur for bad. Concerning the apparent gratuitousness or pointlessness of much evil, if the atheist argues that, well, certain suffering, a deer dying in a fire in a forest, or even, a little child being raped and murdered, it may appear to be pointless. We can't see it, but we can't tell, is it in fact pointless or not? We talked about that in the last lecture, that our knowledge of how this relates and the effect it's going to have compared to God's is statistically zero. And so basically saying that it appears to be pointless, that's an appeal to ignorance. The atheist must show that there are any cases of genuinely pointless suffering before we can hold that there are many instances of apparently pointless suffering. Now, again, that challenge cannot be met because of our limited perspective and knowledge. An atheist can do no better than produce some evidence that it was probably or appears to be pointless, but you can never prove that it was. Only God knows that. In fact, Timothy Keller points out that in the field of chaos theory, scientists have learned that large macroscopic systems, such as the weather, can be sensitive to the tiniest changes. A classic example is the claim that a butterfly's fluttering in China would be magnified by this ripple effect to determine the path of a hurricane in the South Pacific. Well, no one can calculate any of that, and consequently, even atheist William Rowe admits it would seem to require something like omniscience on our part before we should lay claim to knowing that there is no greater good connected with the fawn's suffering, and so on. Now, look at the quantity of evil. Judgments about how much evil is too much, well, that's all personal opinion. Atheists will say there's way too much, and others might say, no, it's just the right amount. How do we know? We can't tell. And so, is there too much or not? I mean, it's personal opinion, so that cannot count as evidence against God. Now, all of us would wish that there were less evil in the world, but that is simply an assertion, not evidence. And so the fact of the matter is, once again, how this evil, the amount of it, fits into God's plan, we simply cannot tell. And as I mentioned in the last lecture, we cannot assume that two similar evils, God is using them in the same way. Again, it's the issue of our ignorance versus God knows the end from the beginning. He sees how everything fits together. And as we will see, in the end, everyone is going to worship him and see the justice of his ways. Right now, we have to walk by faith, not by sight. And that includes our response to evil. Now, I should point out, God knows everything, and yet we are called to do what we can to remedy evil. He has given us the ability to see. We talked in the book of Habakkuk. When God causes evil and injustice to register with us, that's for a reason. We are called to do what we can to remedy things. And that, in part, might be one of the reasons why God allows this. Finally, in this regard, remember, God was not required to actualize any world at all. His own existence is the highest good. God does not need to show that our world is better than some other hypothetical world, but simply that ours is one of the good possible worlds that God could have created. And one writer points, let's ponder for a moment whether our moral structures can condemn the very being who makes it possible for us even to exist. You see, God didn't have to create anything. He gains nothing from it. His creation was an act of his grace. And so God's power does not obligate him to do every good thing that is possible. He only has to do whatever is good and have a morally sufficient reason for not removing evil, which, as we talked about in the last lecture, he clearly has. He's under no obligation, moral or otherwise, to tell us why he does something or doesn't do something. The Bible does indicate that one day God will create the new heaven and the new earth where there is no longer any pain, suffering, evil, death, or curse. So why didn't he start out that way? Wouldn't that be better? John Feinberg answers, better for what purpose? Presumably, God had many things he wanted to accomplish when he decided to create our world. And there's no way for us to know that this world or that some other world would have brought him more glory, would have been better than this particular world. Because, ultimately, we will see that everything, including the existence of sin and evil, is going to make the new world better than it would have been had it not existed. We can only accept that by faith now, but since God intended to create a world populated by non-glorified human beings and put them where they could function, and that to prevent evil would require vast changes in the world and in human beings, you know, God's plan of creating this kind of world with these kind of people would be thwarted if all evil was to be eliminated, or much evil was to be eliminated, because we wouldn't be the same kind of people we are now. And God cannot logically do two contradictory things. In other words, he can't create a rock too heavy for him to lift. He can't create a square circle. And therefore, if God's plan was to create this kind of a world with these kind of beings, if he could not do that and eliminate evil, he was not required then to do it. Because, why? God did not make a mistake in creating human beings. He obviously places great value on us. He created us in his own image. And therefore, human beings are good in and of themselves. God was not wrong to have these other goals, because they are not evil in and of themselves. And therefore, since he can't at the same time remove evil and accomplish his other goals for this world, he's not obligated to do both. John Hick concludes by saying that focusing on the amount of evil in the world, the critics, like David Hume, are confusing what heaven ought to be as an environment for perfected finite beings, rather than what this world ought to be, an environment for beings who are in the process of being perfected. Now, I want to start looking at, therefore, the relationship between God and the existence of sin and evil. The Bible depicts God as sovereign over everything, and as actively working in all aspects of the world and all aspects of life to bring about his plan. This is known as the doctrine of God's providence. He works in and through his creatures, in and through natural phenomena, to bring about his plan. Now, the Bible says he raises some up, he puts others down. He governs the animals, the weather, and that includes ruling over the actions of human beings, including sinful ones. Now, but God's sovereignty over events includes his sovereignty over sin and evil, but not in a way that makes him sinful or evil. Many people try to shield God from any involvement with sin or evil at all. They attribute it all either to Satan or to the individual. But the Bible presents a more nuanced and complex picture. On the one hand, moral evil is not something that God created when he created other things, because moral evil is not a substance at all. God created substances, including the world and the people in it. He intended that we would act and be able to make choices, and he allows us to do that. He has decreed the existence of sin in such a way that human beings freely, in other words, they're not coerced or forced against their wills or their natures, but we become the authors of our own sin. God did not program us like we were robots or control us like we are puppets. People are able to think their own thoughts and make real choices, and it is we who choose to sin. God respects our integrity as human beings, but God is also present and active. He acts through his people. The Bible indicates sometimes he puts thoughts in our minds and so on. He puts us in different circumstances. And as a result of this comprehensive sovereignty, while at the same time we retain our integrity as human beings, the Bible presents a dual explanation for events. God is sovereign, has ordained all events, and that, in one sense, is a full explanation for all events. Yet at the same time, that is compatible with and does not diminish our responsibility for the choices we make. In another sense, that is a full explanation for all events. This is what is known philosophically as compatibilism. God's sovereignty. He works in us and through us. He ordains everything, and yet we are responsible. We're able to choose, and yet we choose. We don't choose against our will. He doesn't force us. He didn't force Adam and Eve to do what they did. They chose, and yet he had ordained it. That's known as compatibilism. Now, in Appendix 2 in the book, I have multiple examples of this, basically almost 2 pages from Genesis down to Revelation that highlight this, where the very same act in one passage or part of a verse is attributed to God. But the very same act in another verse or another part of the verse is attributed to secondary agents, people, angels, demons, or Satan. Now, let's explain this a little bit, because this is, I think, a critical point. The Bible writers do not shy away from making God in some mysterious way the ultimate cause of many evils, but he does not stand behind evil and good in the same way. A certain distance is maintained whereby all good is attributed to God, but evil is always attributed to the secondary agents. And in other words, he stands behind evil and good asymmetrically. It's not the same. You might analogize it to the author of a play. For example, Shakespeare, famous playwright, he wrote the play Macbeth. In the play, Macbeth killed Duncan. Now, Shakespeare wrote that murder into the play, and the murder took place in the world of the play. Now, it's right for Macbeth to pay for his crime, but everyone would consider it unjust if Shakespeare were tried and put to death for killing Duncan. In fact, we have reason to praise Shakespeare for raising up the character of Macbeth to show us the consequences of sin. Now, yes, there are differences, of course, between a play and us. We are real, Macbeth is not. He's the character of a play. But what this is suggesting, there are different levels of reality between God and us. And God's prerogatives as the playwright, namely the creator, the sustainer, the lawgiver, the judge, and the savior, are far greater than ours. And this suggests a moral difference. God has ordained things. He's ordained the end from the beginning, and yet we are responsible for our choices. And as a result, Christian philosopher Keith Yandel states, what God can allow compatible with his goodness is not what we can allow compatible with ours, because God has shown us what is right, but to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. So when we see injustice, we are obligated by our moral sense to do something about it, and because it is wrong. Now, God is using everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly, sin as well as righteousness, to effect his plan. But that does not change our obligation to do what we can not to sin and to act justly and take care of evil and sin and oppression when we see it. So, as I say, evil and sin is always attributable to the secondary agents. Now, because James 1, verses 12 through 15, tell us how sin arises. It says in verses 13 through 15, let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then, when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. So we are tempted by something inside of us, by our own desires. Now, desires in and of themselves are not evil, but morally, evil comes from human desires. God may put us in circumstances where he knows we are tempted, even where he knows we are going to fall into sin. But that is to test us and to try us. He does not force us into sin. He puts us in a position where we can choose. And unfortunately, many times we do. And that's exactly how sin entered the world. Remember, God created a world without sin and evil. It was very good. God created human beings in the image of God. He put them in a perfect environment. He had fellowship with them, with Adam and Eve. And he even told Adam, there's one thing, don't eat from this one particular tree. Because he warned what will happen. If you do, you will die. And yet, the Bible says, Genesis 3, verse 6, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eye, that the tree was desirable to make one wise. In other words, it was her desire in her. She took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband with her, and he ate. That is known as the fall of mankind. And the fall has affected everything and everyone from that time. Now we come into the world with what's known as the power of indwelling sin. And that it's that power, it induces us to sin. God's not doing that. He warned of the bad consequences that would follow. He did not force Adam and Eve to do that, but created them with the freedom to be able to make a choice. And he knew exactly what they were going to do. But again, from the beginning to end, that's why God, at the very beginning, planned how to come into the world in the person of Jesus Christ as the Savior of humanity. And in fact, the Bible indicates that people may have one motive for an act, that God has a different motive for the exact same act. For example, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. That was evil. That was sin. And yet at the end, when they got together in Genesis 50, verse 20, Joseph said, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So it's not that they sold him into slavery because they were evil, and then God said, oh, now what can I do to bring good out of this? No, he says, God meant it. He was there right at the beginning. And, look at the classic, situation. Well, in Isaiah chapter 10, it talks about how God is using the Assyrians as the rod of his anger to punish Israel, but then he's going to punish them because they are just saying it's all about me, kind of like the Babylonians in Habakkuk. We saw the same thing. Look at the crucifixion itself. In Acts chapter 2, verses 23 and 24, it says this. This man, referring to Jesus, delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. So God predetermined that Jesus was going to the cross. But you nailed him to the cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. But God raised him up again. So in other words, it was godlessness, it was disobedience, it was sin, and yet that had all been predetermined by God. Pilate, the Romans, the Jewish leaders, the people, and so on, they made choices. God did not, and the betrayal by Judas Iscariot. Jesus, or God, didn't force Judas to betray Jesus. He chose to do so, yet it had all been predetermined by God. This is compatible, and again, it shows that compatibilism has to be true, because the crucifixion illustrates this. If the initiative had been entirely with the conspirators and God came along at the last minute, then the cross was not his plan. Yet it was his plan from the beginning. And on the other hand, if God was orchestrating events so that the humans involved were just puppets or robots, then it would be foolish to talk of sin or call them godless men. So these two things work together. This is a mystery that cannot be fully explained because God's relationship with us is unlike anything else. He is infinite. We are finite. There's nothing else like it in the universe. And therefore, we need to understand he is uniquely qualified to know when to ordain and permit evil and suffering and when not to. He alone can be good in allowing evil and suffering that a good human being who does not have his exhaustive knowledge would try to prevent. So we're going to look at more in the next lecture on God's relationship with sin and evil. We need to understand this better because it is of crucial importance for the so-called problem of evil.